How many factories are they going to shut down? How many million people are going to say they can't drive their cars anymore? How many, ski-doos and yachts and how are they going to do that? They never ever say it, and every single time those politicians promise that, they're always lying. They never ever achieve their goal. It's always easy to look good, and that's the problem with the left often. They want to show off.
Well, we could also point out that the Americans turned radically to natural gas fracking after the year 2000.
Yeah.
And let's just outline the consequences of that. So the first bloody consequence was that they cut their carbon dioxide output by 15%. And that was not something that any environmentalists predicted and certainly would have opposed. But it turned out to be the case that while the Americans essentially made themselves not only energy self-sufficient, but capable of then becoming one of the world's biggest potential exporters of fossil fuel products, they did it in a manner that simultaneously reduced the carbon load.
Absolutely.
And so I look at policies like Trudeau's policy and I think, okay, so what the hell's the goal here exactly? You're going to demonize liquid natural gas in particular, which is an exceptionally clean fuel, which is extremely abundant and which is also extremely inexpensive, which you think would appeal to the lefties because hypothetically they're compared about the poor. And instead of noticing that and touting liquid natural gas as a replacement for coal and for wood, which of course the Germans are madly gathering at the moment to the point of driving firewood into shortage, instead of pointing out that that's a legitimate, clean, and accessible alternative that's also cheap compared to, say, coal in China or coal in Europe for that matter, the notion seems to be, no, we have to do something that we can't do in an impossible manner and create panic and economic havoc while doing it to pretend to do something on the environmental front that absolutely will not happen at all.
It's even worse than that, eh? You talked about the German delegation that came in Canada a few days ago. They even came here in Quebec. Now you're right to say they're going to have to switch over the winter from natural gas to coal, which is much worse. It's 60% more emissions and everything. Like if Canada was exporting our LNG project with gas, we would reduce emissions. So we would do much better for the environment and on top of creating very good jobs in our regions here in Canada. But it's worse than that. We're probably going to have to export coal, because they're also going to run out of coal. So that's going to be okay according to Mr. Trudeau's standards and the left standards and the environmentalist standards. The net, it's all to look good, but when you look at the data, when you look at the results, it's terrible what they're proposing. It's even worse than what they're fighting against.
Well, let's go on that looking good side. So one of the things I found out, this was also true of the Conservative Party in Ontario. And I'm, relatively positively predisposed to the Conservatives in Ontario, especially given the nature of the alternative. During COVID, and I know this because I was told this by senior members of the Ontario government, as well as discussing recently with journalist Ruba Subramania and a group of people who are suing the Canadian government, the court documents have revealed, for example, that the travel ban that Trudeau implemented had, hypothetically to stop the spread of COVID, had so little scientific justification, despite being touted as scientifically justifiable, that even though the Trudeau cabinet gave direct orders to the people working in their health departments to formulate a scientific rationale to justify the ban, the people so ordered couldn't, even though some of them were willing to attempt to do so. So it lacked such scientific justification that even under duress, the people tasked with generating the rationale post hoc couldn't do it. And that the reason the bloody travel ban was implemented to begin with, which deprived about 7 million people of the right to visit their dying relatives in hospitals, for example, the actual rationale was that the Liberal minority government, federally headed by Trudeau, wanted to launch a precipitous election to put themselves in a majority position and was looking for a wedge issue to divide Canadians so that they could ramp up their grip on power. And this has all been revealed in court documents. It's utterly preposterous. And so I'm pointing that out as part of a broader trend, this trend of, let's say, looking good. Well, why are we implementing a travel ban? Well, because we're so concerned about your health. It's like, well, no, that's not why. You want to look like you're concerned about our health, but actually you want to catalyze your grip on power in the most manipulative way possible. But then I also know, let's say on the conservative side, when COVID policies were being formulated and they were being touted as driven by the science, all that was happening was that they were generating opinion polls that were sampling people's fear, noting what they were most afraid of, reacting to that fear with draconian lockdowns, although not as bad in Ontario as in Quebec, and then post hoc justifying that with a science that didn't exist, and then demonizing anyone who claimed that the science did not support that and that the measures were overreaching.
It was not just federally, by the way. Here in Quebec, we went through even worse than that with the curfew. There was not one single study showing that a curfew is having an impact to stop COVID. Actually, there's even people who and suggestions that it's even worse because you're concentrating more people in a few hours, so it's spreading faster. And when we were asked, when the premier was asked for studies, we found out afterwards that the public health director was sending notes to his bureaucrats can you find me a study? Just before the press conference they were looking for, and they couldn't find one. And when they were asked, what scientific evidence do you have that curfews could stop the spreading of COVID? You know what they came out with? A public opinion poll. That's the science they had. And they said, look, this is what people want. So that's not science. I understand there's a methodology that is scientific, but that's about it. It's political science.
That's what frightened people want when you ask them stupid questions that they answer impulsively when they've been frightened specifically and pointedly by their governments in collusion with the idiot legacy media that they're subsidizing. So it isn't even, because people will say, well, that's what people wanted and maybe you should give it to them. It's like, and this is back to that principle of subsidiarity and distributed political responsibility. You do not randomly sample impulsive public opinion and derive your doctrines of governance. So I would ask you, how would you protect yourself if you were the leader of the Conservative Party in Quebec and the Premier from falling into that trap? Because I've seen people all across the political spectrum claim allegiance to principles, but then governed by opinion polls.
Two things I want to